Hi, everybody. Welcome to Watchung Booksellers, Evening with the Authors. I'm Margot Sagel. I'm the owner, and I am very pleased tonight to welcome Jessica S. Henry, who's going to talk about Smoke But No Fire, Convicting the Innocent of Crimes That Never Happened. She'll be in discussion with her friend and colleague, Raman Gill, who I will introduce them both in a moment. But before we begin, for those of you who may not be familiar with Crowdcast, just sort of go over how it works. On the right-hand side, you will see a comments column, and you can make comments throughout, introduce yourselves, say hello to each other. But if you want to address any questions to Jessica, at the very bottom, it's ask a question box, and you just place your questions there. If you find there's a question already there similar to yours, just vote on it, and it moves the question up to the top of the list. Most importantly, at the very bottom of the screen here, you'll see this green button where you can link to Watchung Booksellers and purchase your copy of Smoke But No Fire. And Jessica will be available to sign and personalize books if you would like to make such a request. And now I think I would like to bring Jessica and Raman on and introduce you both. Hi, Jessica.
Hi.
Hi, Raman. Thank you both for joining us and coming to talk to us to share this important book. Jessica Henry was a public defender for nearly 2 decades, for 10 years in New York City before becoming professor of the Department of Justice Studies at Montclair State University. She's also a criminal justice expert, a legal commentator, and blogger with a particular focus on wrongful convictions, police corruption and misconduct, mass incarceration, and the death penalty. She lives in Montclair with her family. And Raman Gill is a criminal defense attorney. Her career began as a public defender in Dallas, Texas. She went on to work at Texas Appleseed, where she was the lead advocate in establishing the nation's first mental health public defender's office. She is now in private practice with Sumter and Gonzalez in Austin, Texas, where she defends clients charged with crimes ranging from misdemeanors to murder. Thank you both so much for taking the time to share Jessica's book with us, and we look forward to your discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone.
Hi, everybody. Hello, hello.
I'm so excited about this.
I can't even.
I know you've done a bunch of this, but seriously, this is just such an honor. And I got to tell you, you know that I read the book. Me and a small group of friends, we were actually involved in the sort of chapter-to-chapter editing process.
They were. Without them, I would have been toast.
But I've actually had a chance to it was fun to read the book recently again. And just with a set of fresh eyes. And I know I'm biased, but I have to say, to me, this book is the primer. It is a primer on all the basics and what you need to know as you watch the news and you're following current events. This is the book that really sets out what you need to know about what is broken in policing and in the criminal justice system. And it is told in such riveting fashion. And I want to start, and I do have notes, so forgive me if I look down every now and again, but I want to start on page 20 because this really, just read to you this. You say, whenever I share the subject of this book, people are stunned to learn that there is even such a thing as a no-crime wrongful conviction. Girl, I was stunned to learn this, and I work in the system. So start off by just telling us, what is a no-crime wrongful conviction? How in the world could someone be convicted of something that never happened? And how often does it happen? And just tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of you probably have heard about wrongful convictions or people who are convicted of crimes that were committed by someone else. And that's sort of what Serial was about for those of you that listen to that podcast, or what Just Mercy is about. And that's kind of the public presentation of what a wrongful conviction is. But no crime wrongful convictions are when innocent people are convicted of crimes that literally never happened. And believe it or not, no crime wrongful convictions make up 1/3 of all known exonerations. And I've got to be honest with you, that's just the tip of the no crime innocence iceberg. We don't know anything about misdemeanor cases. We know very little about people who plead guilty to these types of crimes. And we also obviously just don't know about all the folks who've been wrongly convicted of crimes that never happened, but who haven't been exonerated. So it's a very significant problem, and people just aren't aware that it happens.
So, like, tell me a little bit, how often does it happen? We've all heard about, or some of us have heard about the Innocence Project and exonerations generally, and we know that there's actual crime wrongful convictions. But what percentage are we talking about? And let's talk a little bit about numbers.
Well, it's about 1/3 of all known exonerations. So that's about a little under 1,000. It's about 900 and something cases. I checked recently, and I think it's like 960 or 980. Forgive me, I should have that data right at my fingertips. But one of the interesting things about doing research in wrongful convictions is every day it literally changes. So it's about that. And there are patterns that exist. So we see that women tend to be about 4% of the women of exonerees that are known in the National Registry of Exoneration database, but 17% of no crime exonerees are women. So right there, that's really interesting. We also see patterns involving race. So in all exonerations, African Americans tend to have a higher percentage of people exonerated. In no crime cases overall, white people are a little bit more known to be exonerated, but that's because of crime type. So in child sex abuse cases, white defendants are more frequently exonerated, but in cases like drug offenses, Black defendants are more likely to be exonerated in the context of crimes that never happened in the first place. And the triggers for these are kind of all over the place, but I'd like to tell a story that I start my book with, and I tell this story all the time because it just about kills me, and I can't get my head around the fact that it happened, but it did. And my book is sort of full of stories like that.
And I'm glad you're starting with this story because it'll flatten you when you read it. You just, I was reminded about it and I was like, this didn't actually happen in real life. So tell us a little bit about it.
There was a young man named Rodriguez Crawford. He lived in an African-American poor community in Shreveport, Louisiana. And he, by all accounts, was a really lovely young man who absolutely adored his young son. And he absolutely adored his young son. And one morning, the unthinkable happened. The absolute unthinkable happened. He woke up and his child was lifeless in the bed next to him. And he called 911. And from the second he placed that call, things went incredibly south. So for instance, the dispatch was so disparaging to the paramedics who were saying the most horrible things about the family. And when the paramedics arrived at the home, they referred to it as a crime scene. And the ambulance workers came in and took this small baby and put it in the ambulance and locked the doors to the family and called the police before they actually broke the terrible news to the family that the child, in fact, had died. And when the police arrived, they took Mr. Crawford and they dragged him down to the precinct. Instead of treating him like a grieving father, they treated him like a criminal suspect. And then the medical examiner, instead of waiting for the lab reports, declared that the child had been smothered to death in the case of a homicide. And then when the lab reports came back showing pneumonia and sepsis in this baby's lungs, the medical examiner said, oh, that's just a coincidence. And then Mr. Crawford had the misfortune of having his case assigned to a man named Dale Cox, who was known throughout Louisiana as just adoring the death penalty. He was a hanging prosecutor, and he did everything that he could to get Mr. Crawford to be convicted. And he, in fact, was successful. And Mr. Crawford was sent to Louisiana's notorious death row, only to eventually have his conviction overturned in part because the baby had died from pneumonia and sepsis in his lungs. And the reason I like to talk about this case is because it so illustrates the impact of race and racism, of poverty, of tunnel vision, of the paramedics sort of shaping this as a crime scene, and the medical examiner buying into this, and the police buying into this, and no one taking a step back to say, but this man adored his child. Why would he ever harm this baby? Nobody thought twice about it. And the system just did what the system does best, which is once a crime has been committed, they've got to find the suspect and get that conviction. And no one ever stopped to ask, but was a crime committed in the first place? And if they had, the clear answer would have been no.
So tell us a little bit more, because this happens. We see this all the time in our practice. I'd say in the last 5 years, we've seen, in the context of CPS and APS, Adult Protective Service cases, situations where babies or adults that you're caring for in the home have died or been injured, and it was completely an accident, and now you're being charged with a crime.
Yeah, I mean, there's been so many cases, and I talk in a number of different ways about this in the book, but I can give you a couple of stories. There's a woman named Sabrina Butler down in Mississippi, and she had a young child, and this happens, by the way, in the context not, outside of family relationships, but maybe they just affect me the most because I'm a parent, and I can't imagine what it would be like to be accused of a crime instead of being allowed to mourn with my family and friends in the event that, God forbid, something tragic occurred. But Sabrina Butler had a child who became, who suddenly went unconscious, and she did everything in her power to revive her child. And they called 911, and the medical doctors decided that this baby was abused, and she was interrogated for hours by the police, and she eventually made some incriminating statements the statements that the police deemed were incriminating, and she also was sentenced. She was convicted and sentenced to die and put on Mississippi's death row. She was the only woman who was there. Eventually, of course, it was revealed that her efforts to revive the baby doing CPR, and then the medical personnel's efforts to revive the baby in the ambulance and then at the hospital were the source of the injuries. And the baby actually had an internal disease that caused his death that had just never been diagnosed.
And in fact, they didn't even find that out, except for the fact that she just luckily happened to be pregnant and have another baby.
No, that's a different
story.
That's a different story. Roman's referring to a case, and I'll be really quick here. There was a woman who had a child who had this very, very rare genetic disorder, but it mirrored poisoning. It mirrored that the child had been given antifreeze. And so she was convicted of murdering her child for poisoning him by antifreeze. But during the court, right before she was charged, she had already become pregnant. And her second child, which was whisked away into foster care, right? She never actually had access to this child, wound up with the same symptoms. And finally, some doctor, a light bulb went off and thought, wait a minute, this is this very rare genetic disorder. And even then, it wasn't until a TV show got interested and went back and reinvestigated the crime for which she was incarcerated that they realized, oh my gosh, this woman was convicted of murdering her child when he had this very rare medical diagnosis.
I know. I just, and something I love about the book, honestly, Jess, is like, it's like story after story after story. It was, I know this, but it was such a reminder of like, this happens so much more often.
Yeah. And it's not, so we've been talking about medical misdiagnoses, but that's only one of the triggers. So whether it's forensic error, right? Some of you may know the case of Cameron Todd Willingham, who was, he was actually executed for the arson murder of his 3 children. Fire scientists have gone back and looked at that case and they were like, that was not arson. That was an accidental fire. But so there's the case where experts misdiagnose a naturally occurring event as a crime, but there's other triggers too, right? So false accusations, somebody, whether it's because they want retaliation against somebody or because they're in the midst of a terrible custody or divorce dispute. One of the most recent exonerations is a no-crime case out of Idaho that involves a man convicted of molesting his 7-year-old. Turns out the whole thing was fabricated and the child was put up to telling this story by the mom who had lost custody of her child and manufactured this terrible story. So there's the context of false accusations, and then there's the contributions of the police.
So that's what I want to get to next, because I mean, we're all watching the news. There's a lot of news these days. It's not very good, in my opinion. But we're all watching the news, and everyone, of course, knows about George Floyd. And some of the cases that like we're talking about here are extreme, right? People on death row, people in these situations where you are like, okay, come on. I get it. That's very, very tragic, but that doesn't happen that often. You and I know it happens way more often than it should, but here's the thing, even more than that, smaller things that lead to far less punishment, but punishment nonetheless happen every day in the criminal justice system, hundreds of times a day, especially to Black people and brown people. So I want to talk a little bit about that in the context of, let's talk about resisting arrest cases. And let's talk a little bit about your experience as a public defender with trespass cases in New York.
Yeah, so, the police contribute to no crime wrongful convictions in two different ways. We'll talk about the second way, which is overt, flagrant misconduct in just a second. But what Raman is referring to is aggressive policing policies. And those are sometimes set out by our leadership, right? So when I was a public defender in New York City, there was a program called Broken Windows Policing. And they were going to go in, and the idea was they were going to prosecute, they're going to arrest people for really low level offenses. And that was somehow going to make the community safer and better. And one of the areas they really honed in on was trespassing. But what the police were routinely doing was going into low-income housing buildings and arresting anybody who was in the lobby, including people who had left their apartment and gone to get the mail but didn't have their ID on them, including people who were there to visit their mom, aunt, grandma. That's not trespassing. And these folks would get arrested and brought to the precinct. They'd be booked, fingerprinted, photographed, kept in a jail pen behind the courthouse, sometimes overnight. And then they would be brought before the judge. And I would beg them. I'd say, listen, this is not trespassing. You were arrested for this thing. You did not trespass. If you will come back to court, I will fight this case. And inevitably, they wanted to plead guilty because they wanted to go home. They had childcare responsibilities. They didn't want to take the time off from work. They knew that coming back to court was this very onerous, degrading process. And so they would take a misdemeanor conviction. And what is true about misdemeanor convictions is many people are like, oh, that's just a petty offense, but they matter. They matter so much. They bring people into the criminal justice system. They create a criminal justice footprint. They dampen. The Brennan Center just issued a report this week that shows the misdemeanor convictions dampen income levels for the rest of people's lives, makes it harder to get work. Misdemeanors really matter. And yet so many people in New York City were convicted of trespassing, often on a plea of guilty for trespasses that didn't occur. And 95% of the people who were stopped in one area were Black and brown. That's not a coincidence. That's a targeted policing practice.
Absolutely. And I have often said, like, I think so much of the hard work needs to be done in misdemeanor court. It's not as glamorous. Absolutely. And it doesn't catch the headlines, but it is the place where people take these little hits that really affect housing, ability to get jobs, and it's so disproportionately focused on poor people and people of color. And it happens, this is where you see no crime wrongful convictions happen. Yep. Not the once or twice, but like the hundreds of times a day. Tell me, let's talk a little bit about resisting arrest, because you mentioned a story in the book that I talked to you about when I was the public defender. It was my most heartbreaking case.
Oh, I wasn't even going to tell that story. Yeah. Oh, gosh. Yes. So, and this kind of does dovetail with the other way that police contribute to no crime wrongful convictions. So on the one hand, they participate in these aggressive policing practices, just like the one I told you about with trespassing. We saw that in Baltimore with the gun trace task force. We see this overly aggressive policing tactics all throughout the country. But then there's also overt misconduct, and some of that misconduct often occurs in the context of, and some of the wrongful convictions that are produced by that are when the police try to cover up their own wrongdoings. And resisting arrest is just one of those examples. And so in the book, I talk about actually one of Raman's cases where she had an African-American client who was surrounded by white officers who beat the crap out of him. And a Black witness saw the whole thing. And this Black witness had nothing to do with the person who was beaten, nor anything to do with the police. They just literally were living there and they saw what happened. And when Rumman went to trial on this case, because her client was like, I didn't do anything. I was literally living my life. The next thing you know, the police are beating me up. Then I got charged with resisting arrest. I didn't do anything. And this witness said, I saw the whole thing, and that's 100% true. And he was convicted of resisting arrest.
Yeah,
because the officer's words were credited over that of a Black witness and a Black defendant.
The Black
We see that a lot too. I mean, so perhaps even more famously, so that's Rumman's story, but in Tulia, Texas, and some of you may have seen the documentary about this or read the book, but there was a white officer who was brought in to stamp out the drug problem in Tulia, Texas. That would be the drug problem that no one knew Tulia was experiencing. And Tom Coleman single-handedly arrested something like 10% of the population, the Black population of Tulia, Texas. And he did it on his say-so. He didn't have any lab reports confirming the existence of drugs, and he didn't have any notes, and he didn't have a partner. And he used to take notes, and I'm not kidding, on his arm that would wash off in the shower. So 46 defendants get arrested. And the first few took it to trial because they were like, I don't deal drugs. I don't have drugs. I don't even know who this guy is. Like, what is going on here? And they lost, and they lost big. And the judge, through the sentences that these people got were so long that the rest of the defendants all pled guilty. Well, later on, it turns out that Tom Coleman had manufactured every single case. There were no drugs. And all of the people were exonerated, but not before many of them had spent years in prison. And that's because our legal system so often credits the word of an officer over the word of a Black defendant.
No, in my case, it was a Black witness who saw the whole thing from his home, from the window. Saw 5 white police officers beating up my Black defendant. And I'm so thankful, Jessica, for the advent of body cameras and for cell phone footage that now people are seeing on social media what we in the criminal justice system have been seeing for decades. We know it's been happening, and it's now being recorded. And we know the stuff that's being recorded is the tip of the iceberg.
Absolutely. And just to go back to resisting arrest, I tell another short little story in the book. There was a man up in Alaska, and his name was Vasily Gregory. And he was walking home one evening, minding his own business, and he got arrested for resisting arrest. And he went to court that night, and he pled guilty and went home. And we never actually would have heard of him or his case. Like, it should have just been a non-issue because most of these cases never get reported. But what happened was an anthropologist, a scientist, a social scientist happened to be there. Like, it was just the most random thing. And she actually saw what happened, which was this white officer went over to Gregory and just lifted him up off his feet and threw him to the ground, ripped his backpack off, beat him up, and then charged him with resisting arrest. And she went and filed a report with the local police and was making such a stink that they had to investigate it. And in the course of the investigation, to your point, there was a security camera. And sure enough, nothing had happened. He had literally been minding his own business. So we see these kinds of cases happening all the time where, again, officers' words are credited. And unless there's something that really bolsters the credibility of the people who are actually the victims, they get wrongly convicted. And it's terrible.
And then it happens, I'm sorry for those watching, I guess you're seeing me be like, because it happens like, this is not every now and again. It is hundreds of times a day.
And even at the start, when you said to me, how often do these happen? And I said it was a third of all known exonerations, but really the number is just, especially as we're talking about these misdemeanor cases, nobody knows about them. Nobody cares about them, but I do, because I do think they really matter. And at the high end, so back to Texas, me and Rumman were often joking how half my book is just Texas. I mean, I don't know what my book would have been like if Texas wasn't just so messed up on the criminal justice front. But, there was this crazy thing that was happening in Harris County, Texas, where lots of brown people were routinely being stopped by the police. And the police would do this thing called a field test, and they would test substances they believed were drugs, and the field test would come back positive, and so folks would get arrested, and then they would plead guilty to possession of drugs, felony offenses, and they would, eventually get released. But Harris County did something very unusual. They sent the field test out to the labs anyway. Most of the time, once a person pleads guilty, the case is over. But they sent them out, and the lab results finally came back, and they were like, no drugs, no drugs, no drugs. Over 100 and something people had pled guilty to possessing drugs that were not drugs. So, I mean, this happens all over the country.
I want to talk about this. I want to talk about this because this is something we talk about all the time. And in Texas, this is such a Texas term, and I don't know if it's the same term you guys have up north. We have these things, and this is how, I know people watching are like, what? Why in the world are people pleading to things that they're not guilty of? And I want to talk to you a second because bad stuff is happening out on the streets with police. And I think a frustration I have is that people think, well, it's getting fixed. It's getting fixed by the system. Once the case goes into the system and we have prosecutors, right? I want to talk to you about something called rocket dockets. And that's what we call it in Texas. That is where so many cases get resolved with things like quick little street lab drug tests and other things like bail. Talk to us a little bit about why would someone plead guilty on a rocket docket? What's in play there, and how does that happen? And it happens again thousands of times a day. Go.
So I'm so glad you brought this up because, you know, I do think the media right now is really focused on policing, but I want to talk also about prosecutors because they don't get half the attention I think they deserve, right? So prosecutors are supposed to be ministers of justice. And one of their first tasks is when the police arrest somebody, they're supposed to actually take a look at the evidence on which the police base their arrest and decide whether they even want to proceed with the case. They have the discretion at that moment to dismiss, but they often don't. So whether it's the trespass cases I was talking about or drug arrests based on field tests, what they will often do is make a sweetheart deal that you got to take or leave at that moment. And for a lot of defendants, they take it. But prosecutors shouldn't be in such a rush. And Rem had mentioned bail, and this is getting a little wonky. You know, New Jersey is one of the nation's leaders in bail reform. So this has become, in the last year, so much less of an issue. But also, so many people will take that rocket docket plea, that take it or leave it plea, because the prosecutor says, and if you don't, I'm going to seek bail, and you're not going to be able to make it. And so they say, okay, I'm going to take this so I get to go home. So again, we see this intersection of poverty and often race, and prosecutors not doing their job, which is to do justice. But it's not just at these rocket dockets, right? Prosecutors at every step of the way have an opportunity to make sure that the things that they're trying to do are just and fair and based on evidence. But instead, they get so caught up in the game of getting a conviction that they do whatever it takes.
But before you go there, I want to explain to people for a second. What we're talking about, and I don't know that people understand, you go to jail, and either you're in a jurisdiction where bail isn't set right away, or in Texas where it is set, and it, like so many other things, it sucks to be poor. And if you cannot afford to post bail, really the only way to get out of jail is to resolve your case. Yep. And that is the pressure that poor people have, that people with means don't have. And that is why people take deals and they say, fine, I'll just sign for it because I got to work my kids. I got to go work my job. Right. I can't
so many times I say to my students in my class, when we're talking about issues involving wrongful convictions, they say, I would never plead guilty to something I didn't do. But by the time I'm done telling them why people do plead guilty, they think, oh, maybe I would. Because there is so much pressure and the consequences are so, back to the two Leah cases. I mean, these defendants knew, they saw that if they went to trial and lost, they were going to be serving decades, whereas they could get out on a probationary plea. Now, you got to ask yourself, if a case is really worth 30 years after trial, why is somebody going to get probation if they plead guilty? But that's how the system sometimes works. And prosecutors are right in the mix. And instead of making sure that they've got the evidence to support convictions, they'll do things like present unreliable evidence. So for instance, they'll put in, there are dentists, they're called forensic odontologists, and they claim that they can match a bite mark on somebody's hand to a person's teeth imprint. Now, I'm telling you right now, you can't. The National Academy of Forensic Sciences issued a report saying you can't. It's complete junk. And even though it is complete junk, prosecutors still try to introduce that kind of junk science to shore up bad cases. or they'll call a witness in who they know is not credible, or they'll get a jailhouse informant who's got everything to gain and nothing to lose by pleading guilty. I mean, by telling lies on the stand. And they do this all even though they know they shouldn't. Or they will hide evidence, right? So prosecutors have a constitutional obligation to turn over evidence that is exculpatory. That's the legal term. It just means any evidence that can help the defendant either prove his innocence or demonstrate that some of their own witnesses are, likely to engage in falsity. And they often don't. It's called a Brady violation. And in fact, one federal judge got so outraged, he said, there is an epidemic of Brady violations. And there was just a huge case going on in New York right now about these Brady violations, just how terrible they are. And they can turn the course of a case. In fact, many times an exoneration is based on evidence that the prosecution knew about and hid. And you know why they can do this, Roman? Because they have what's called absolute immunity. Now, lots of folks are talking about qualified immunity for police officers. And
tell us the difference. What's the difference between qualified and absolute?
So police officers, what's been in the news is that, police officers, it's really hard to hold them accountable because you have to meet a standard of qualified immunity. And the standard as interpreted by the courts has become incredibly narrow and incredibly high. It's hard to prove that an officer violated a constitutional principle. And again, I don't want to get too wonky here, but but if you can prove it, you can actually hold an officer accountable. Prosecutors have absolute immunity for the things that they do in the course of being a prosecutor, meaning you cannot ever, there is no bar to meet. They are completely protected. Now, you might be wondering why. I wonder why. But the truth is that's the standard. And the courts, I can tell you what the courts say. The courts say that we need to have prosecutors who would be a prosecutor if they could be held accountable. And then they go on to say, well, the bar associations are the ones that should hold prosecutors accountable. And let me tell you something, that does not happen.
Well, I want to talk about that. I actually want to read something out of your book because I don't think people understand. I want to break this down for people. So, because I know there's a lot of confusion, right? Like we're seeing all this stuff with George Floyd and we're seeing everyone's like, these officers need to be charged with crimes, which almost never happens.
Nope.
And see, these are, it's only when the public knows about it. And there's immense pressure that we're even seeing a conversation about.
Right. And even remember, even when cases are presented to the grand jury, right? Even when the prosecutor's been so pressured into putting it in front of the grand jury, there's an expression in the criminal defense bar that a prosecutor can indict a ham sandwich, meaning, it's just in a grand jury, it's just the prosecutor's version of events. But let me tell you something, interestingly, in many of these kinds of cases, prosecutors can't seem to get an indictment.
So exactly, right? When it comes to a plea. So number one, and we're in the worst, most outrageous cases, it is so hard with all the pressure.
So hard.
To prosecute a police officer for murdering somebody. Mm-hmm. Forget all these cases that we talk about with resisting arrest where our clients were assaulted by a police officer for no reason. Those never see the light of day. So then we say, okay, that's fine. We're going to sue the police officer. And we know that that's so hard to do.
So hard to do.
Okay, we're going to sue the prosecutor who hides evidence and legitimizes bad policing. Guess what? Can't do it at all. And not only that, fine. Okay, then we're going to sanction the prosecutor. We're going to sanction them. They're going to get disbarred. They're going to get something, right? Okay, page 87. A 2013 analysis conducted by the Center for Prosecutor Integrity found that less than, are you ready for this? 2%, less than 2% of prosecutors are ever sanctioned in any form for misconduct. I get so tired, Jess. I'm going to be straight up with you. I go to parties. People. How can you do your job?
Right. How could you represent guilty people?
Represent people that are guilty of crime. And I'm sorry, and I'm sorry if there's prosecutors watching. How can you not? As far as I'm concerned, I'm wearing the white hat, and it's me against the evil empire.
Right. But more fundamentally, right, I do think one of the things that we see going back to moving away from the evil empire. But I mean, one of the not fun things, that's such the wrong word, one of the interesting things or compelling things about no crime, wrongful convictions is it does let us kind of shine a bright light on everything that's wrong in criminal justice, because I don't care if you're a prosecutor, well, most prosecutors, most Republicans, most Democrats, conservative, Republican, whatever you think, most folks can get on board with the idea that we should not be spending taxpayer money to investigate, prosecute, convict, and incarcerate people for crimes that never happened, right? I mean, that is just such a colossal waste of human spirit and of money and of energy and of resources, and it just breaks the backs of communities, and it's so unnecessary. And when we stop and think, well, what are the things that are going on that contribute to this? Policing, prosecutors, underfunded defense lawyers, right? I mean, we are so willing to pull millions of people into the system, but we're so unwilling to make sure that they get adequate legal defense. It's a huge problem, particularly when the people we keep pulling in are poor, right? And often people of color. So we've got this system in place that doesn't actually make a lot of sense. And judges are involved, right? Judges just kind of oversee this system that has gone so awry, and they don't intervene when they really could be very impactful. So it's kind of a whole range of things that go wrong at every step of the way.
It is, and I know, and I think what people don't understand is, you know, what you have in some jurisdictions. In Texas, for example, we are building a public defender system in Texas that we have not had.
Yeah, a lot of places don't have them.
A lot of places don't have public defender systems.
Yeah,
and
Alabama.
Yeah, where they have them, they're super underfunded.
Yeah.
But so then who defends poor people? They are people off of these, I don't want to get to, again, like you two in the weeds, but basically defense lawyers that are paid, you know, a set fee, $300, go resolve the case. Yeah. And you know, like, if you're going to, you know, there's just no financial incentive. You'd be upside down and unable to put food on your table trying to actually prove someone's innocence or lodge a meaningful defense.
And I talk about that in the book. I mean, there are jurisdictions where lawyers literally have 7 minutes from the moment they meet their client, spend 7 minutes from the moment they meet their client to the moment the case is resolved by a plea. Like, you can barely get somebody's name and what happened in 7 minutes. So, you know, there are all these huge issues. But there are suggestions, there are methods or means that we have at our disposal to at least improve the system to reduce the prevalence of no crime wrongful convictions. And again, one of the fun things, and again, I'm using the word fun, but one of the interesting things about this is that you can use these reforms not just to correct no crime wrongful convictions, but ultimately to make the criminal legal system a better and ideally more fair place. You know, and one of those suggestions, just going out of the gate, would be to stop bringing so many people into the system in the first place, right? If we could decriminalize some of these crimes, we stopped focusing on trespassing. If folks are, you know, willing to look the other way for marijuana convictions, whatever they are, we could really change the numbers in the system, which would improve the quality of defense, allow prosecutors to even spend a little bit more time looking at the cases before they move them forward. It would make a big difference if we could just step back and reduce the scope and the prevalence of our system. But let's
talk about that, because that actually is, I've spent some time, you and I have spent some time slamming on police officers, slamming on prosecutors, but that is an important point that you just raised, which is the reality on the other side is police officers we fund police officers, we don't fund other things. And so police officers are dealing with mental health issues and other issues that they aren't really trained or equipped to handle. And we criminalize so much behavior. And there is, I'm sure a prosecutor would tell you, really, how am I supposed to dig into all the hundreds of cases I get a day and figure out what's what?
Yeah, so I mean, so that would be like if I could pick one thing on my list, that's probably one of the biggies, but there are others, and some of it has to do with immunity. I'd love to see us reconsider all the immunities that are out there. Prosecutors having absolute immunity, the way that qualified immunity is interpreted for police officers, I don't quite understand how we've come to where we are, and I think we can do better. I'd like to see improvements in forensic science and the kinds of evidence that's allowed in, because as you saw from the start of this talk, so many people get pulled into the system because of a misdiagnosis or a mislabeling of an event as a crime when it really wasn't criminal at all. And so with just a few of those changes, I think we could make a really, really big difference. And oh my goodness, Roman, I think we may have to go to questions.
Okay, let's do it. And I'm sorry, I'm looking over here. Oh my gosh, there's been all this chatter going on.
I know, but I think you got to go to the ask a question part, because I think that's the official. Yeah, if you have a question, I didn't get a chance to see the chat either, but I think if you've got an official question, you got to go to the official question, please.
Yes. So we do want to take questions. If you have questions, please pose them. I'm going to look through some of these and let's talk about this. I have a question here from Kazi. Hey, Kazi. Okay. The question is, what is it going to take for the broader criminal justice system to accept the pervasive presence of systemic racism and ACT? What's it going to take?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a great question, and it's a complicated one, right? I mean, if any of you have watched the movie 13th, or if you've read Michelle Alexander's wonderful book, The New Jim Crow, you'll see that the modern criminal legal system is just replicating racial patterns that have existed since we kind of created this country. And so for us to make a difference, we sort of need to own that history and own the policies that led us there. But I also do think that some of the things that we were talking about decriminalization, police training is another really big issue, right? Right now, when young police officers are brought into that academy, all idealistic, they are taught that their loyalty really lies to the brothers and the sisters in that room. And that needs to shift. They need to be taught that their loyalty lies to the communities that they police. And they also need to be taught that when a fellow officer is engaging in misconduct, that they need to call it out. And there are some cities around the country that are exploring that with this program called EPIC. Ethical Policing is Courageous. And that is a program where police officers are actually trained to call out each other's wrongdoing. And it's not just the training at the bottom, it's also got to be the supervisors at the top who buy into the whole vision of doing a better job. So I do think policing can be changed if we were to start modeling different ideas about not the blue wall of silence, but really celebrating the idea of working in the community for the community, and that misconduct is not a part of policing. That could change things a little bit as well.
And I want to say, and I want to pause here, not all police officers are bad, and not all prosecutors are bad. I'm going to get to a question that Rachel Fagan is asking in a second, but that's such an important point, because part of the problem isn't that like 90% of the police officers are misbehaving, but just there's a small percentage, and then there's a culture of not calling it out. And I think if we could change the culture of silence and not calling it out, we could weed out the small percentage of officers that create a large percentage of the problem. Let me ask, Alma Schneider is asking.
Hi, Alma.
I know I'm trying to put some of your peeps in here and not just go to all my peeps.
We're all together. Anyone here, we're all each other's peeps.
Hey, Alma. Okay, what can we do as everyday citizens to remedy these horrible situations?
Yeah, so excellent question. And Alma, shout out to Alma, who's an incredible community activist who actually was working with someone who was exonerated in New York City, helping him sort of reintegrate into society, particularly reteaching him how to kind of cook and think about managing his life in that way. So thank you, Alma, for the great work that you do. Part of it is just getting informed, right? Because if you don't know the problem exists, then you can't do anything about it. And then the second thing is making sure that you are in contact with your legislators and letting them know that criminal justice reform is important to you. Now, in New Jersey, this is less of an issue, but in places like Texas, prosecutors are elected, and you can do quite a bit of good just by getting behind a progressive DA, someone who has a reformist agenda. That can make a huge difference because it sets out, again, what kinds of crimes are prosecuted, whether bail is going to be sought, how much bail is going to be sought, what kinds of rocket docket issues are there going to be. George Soros actually spearheaded a national movement to try to fund progressive DAs. So that is an issue that's coming up in this election right now. Doesn't affect us in particular, in us Jersey folks, but there's lots of ways you can get involved just in supporting progressive DAs. So that's two examples.
I want to give a big shout out here because my hometown of Austin, Texas, in my opinion, just elected an amazingly progressive person to be our next district attorney. Jose Garza is coming in as our district attorney on a very reform-minded agenda, and I really hope and expect that we're going to see some dramatic changes, and it's the guy to do it. And I think you're right. And I think what happens, and we've heard Barack Obama remind us of this. We've heard. I love that piece that President Obama wrote, which is, hey, we talk about national elections so much.
But it's so important on the local level. I mean, Philadelphia elected a guy named Larry Krasner, and things in Philadelphia have never been the same. In a good way, if you're interested in criminal justice reform, they really made a tremendous impact just having him in office. So yeah.
If you want to change this system or the system in your community, pay attention to who is your mayor, who is on your city council, and who is your district and county attorney. Yeah. Those are the races, and those are the people that really make the difference on your local level, and it's profound. Rachel Fagan asked, and maybe we've answered this question. In your experience, are there any police officers or prosecutors who also recognize that there are major issues and would be allies in the attempt to correct them, or does that just not exist?
No, it absolutely exists. I mean, we were just talking about that with the context of progressive DAs. Of course. I mean, I know it's easy to kind of just go down this like, and all police are bad, all prosecutors are bad. And that's just 100% not true. Most folks go into policing because they really want to make a huge difference. And most prosecutors go into prosecuting because they too believe in the system and they want to do good. But there's something that happens, whether it's in the training or in the culture of the offices, that can really shift that process. But yeah, absolutely. When you have a prosecutor with a vision or a police officer who's willing to implement EPIC, I mean, that can make a huge difference. So yeah, sure.
I think that's good. And I think it's so important. I'm glad you asked that question, Rachel. It's super easy to be so demoralized right now and to say there's just no hope. But I'm glad that you mentioned that there are things that you can actually do.
Absolutely.
And there are people, prosecutors, that will work with us hand in hand to change things. We just got to get them elected and make sure they're the people leading these offices and making change.
And if I can just talk about one other thing that you can do on the ground is if you're interested in the issue of bail, there are a number of organizations now, because some jurisdictions just refuse to implement bail reform, there are projects. You can actually donate $100 to a bail project, and that $100 will be used to bail out someone who should not be held pending the outcome of their case. So bail projects are another possible way you can support organizations that are doing real good work on the ground. Sorry, go ahead. Next question.
Catherine Morbe is asking a question. Catherine, I see your question. I'm going to pass it on to Jessica after the event. It's a super specific question, and so she'll get back to you. Just from San Antonio is asking what legislation needs to be in place, and what can we talk about in terms of legislation? I want to see if you could talk for a second, Jess. You know that Kamala Harris has been behind some super progressive policing legislation, I think involving immunity issues, but what kind of things are out there percolating that we should be paying attention to and asking of our local officials and also on the national level?
Yeah, so I mean, there's been a lot of, again, talk in the federal legislative level about policing. And to be clear, most of policing is done at the state level. So if you really want to make a difference, it's mostly going to happen on the ground. But again, sort of what we've been talking about, just being an active citizen and talking about police training, implementing EPIC, bail reform, progressive prosecutors, immunity issues. These are all things that are really relevant and really important.
So I have a question here, which is, Laura, I love this question from Laura because it talks about sort of our lives as practitioners. How do you not get discouraged or burned out?
Well, so I did this for about 10 years, and I was in the real trenches in the South Bronx working at the Bronx Defenders for a few years. Most of my work was as an appellate lawyer, so I wasn't constantly, sort of faced with just how awful people are treated in the criminal legal system, because it is discouraging and you can get so burned out. But I think at least for me, and I think Raman too, knowing that we were, as public defenders, often the only person that stood between our individual client, who was often poor and often disadvantaged in any number of ways, and the entire system, the police and the prosecutors and the judge and the courthouse, and everybody was stacked against our little client. And the only person who was there defending them was us. And to the extent we were able to do a good job, or to the extent we were able to care and amplify their voices, it felt good. I felt like we were making a difference, even though, to be clear, there were days when I came home and I was like, that just stunk. Because sometimes it does stink. Yeah.
And I want to say this, and I just want to add and jump in, just in light of Ruth Bader Ginsburg's recent passing. So many people have been talking about her life's work and it being such a promotion of justice. And to me, someone who was a public defender for almost 3 years, to me, lifetime people who stick to public defense work for their careers they're just nothing short of heroic. I mean, you all are hearing what it's like in the trenches every day to go in and fight these battles for poor people. No recognition, your salary stinks. Everyone is asking you, how can you defend people? I mean, you're just assaulted on every side. To me, they are such heroes. But thank you for asking me, Laura.
Maybe that's a great question that I'd like to jump down to. She sort of said, can you link no crime wrongful convictions to voter suppression? And a lot of you may be like, what? What's that connection? But here's the big picture, right? I mean, there are so many states where people with felony convictions are not permitted to vote. There are some states where if you have a felony conviction, you are forever banned from voting. In some states, if you're on parole and probation, you're not allowed to vote. And so remember, because the criminal justice system overly targets poor people, often people of color, what you see is a disparate impact on who's allowed to vote. And remember, in Florida, Gore versus Bush was lost by the number, it was almost like the same number. I forget the exact numbers there, but by almost the same amount of the people who were disenfranchised. So it really matters. That's another area of reform. If you want to get involved in, you can lobby for the elimination of this disenfranchisement rules, because they actually don't have a lot of weight. Like, why should somebody who was once convicted of a felony be forever banned from voting? Well, it doesn't make a lot of sense. And yet there is this connection. So yeah.
It's such an important and great question. Of course, Mimi is the one who asked.
Thank you,
ma'am. Okay, this is a question that we get asked all the time, and I think we've touched on it, but let's make sure. Why would someone plead guilty to having drugs when they didn't have it?
Yeah, so, again, like, people don't quite understand, and I get it. It's so counterintuitive. Why would you ever plead guilty to anything that you didn't do, let alone drugs when you didn't have drugs? Well, I'll give you a great story. So there was in Baltimore, there was this rogue police force that, really went amok. They all are in prison now, or at least the head guy was in prison, although I think I read their convictions were reversed. But anyway, they did egregious things. I can't even tell you. They robbed, they would literally find drug dealers, steal their drugs, and resell them. These were cops that had gone completely rogue. And in one instance, the police officers put black ski masks on, pulled their guns, and went up to a car where Umar Burley was sitting with his cousin. And Umar Burley, thinking he was about to be robbed by these, masked gunmen, took off in his car and crashed into a civilian and killed the civilian. And the officers, fearing that they were going to be exposed for their wrongdoings, planted so much heroin in Umar Burley's car that he didn't know what to do. And he had a prior criminal record, and he was charged with manslaughter and possession of this unbelievable amount of heroin. And he was facing 30 years if he went to trial. And it was going to be his word, the word of someone who has a criminal record, over 8 police officers. And he took a plea to 15 years. Now, he didn't have any drugs. He didn't have one drop of drugs. But he pled guilty because he was so afraid of the alternative. And people plead guilty because they're afraid that their voices will not be credited, and they often aren't. That is not an unreasonable fear. It's a heartbreaking one.
Juries and judges. Here's a news flash for those of you watching. And I think this is changing. Thanks to cell phones and thanks to this kind of media coverage. But historically, juries and judges don't believe the word of Black and brown defendants over white police or police officers.
Color police officers.
And so,
anyways,
no, and also the answer to the question is, why does someone plead guilty? Because they don't have the money to get out of jail, and so their choice is sit in jail for your trial date, which could be months down the road with nobody to take care of your children or your job, or take a deal so you don't lose your house or your kids.
Right, and I talk about that story. There's a story in my book of two women who were arrested as part of this drug sweep. One woman was able to get out on bail, and one woman couldn't. The woman who couldn't get out on bail eventually pled guilty to felony drug possession. She lost her house. Her kids went into foster care. She had to fight to get them back. She was homeless. Her employment prospects were ruined. Her life was devastated. The woman who was able to get out on bail was able to kind of hang in there. And about 8 months later, the prosecution dismissed the charges because there were no drugs. So that's just an example of the impact of being poor, and again, of being Black, because this was a raid on a Black community, in this poor section of where they all lived. And it was terrible. I mean, to literally see the impact of poverty on the trajectory of a case that came out of the same situation.
I mean, and again, I want to emphasize, because I know people think this is truly, when I tell you, this is the norm. People not getting out on jail, poor people getting, quite frankly, I'm sorry for the verbiage here, but they're getting screwed in the system, is a daily occurrence that happens to hundreds and hundreds of people a day across our country. I know we're coming up here on 6 o'clock or 7 Eastern, 6 my time. And there's so many good questions, and I'm sorry that we didn't get to them all. Do we have time for a couple more, or how do we?
No, I think Watchung will tell us when we have to go. But I
want to save
over a little bit, but not too much.
Okay. I'm gonna take 5 minutes extra. I'm gonna save the question that Watchung Booksellers is asking as the last question I want to ask you, and I want to talk a little bit about what Laura Kelso is asking, and also what Ken Waits is asking. Laura is asking you're Laura, and you know Ken. Laura is asking a little bit more about bail reform. And she's asking, can you talk a little bit more about that, and what has been, talk a little bit more about bail reform and what's going on with that.
Oh gosh, Laura, that is why don't I send you offline a whole bunch of material about what New Jersey did. New York tried to follow suit. They didn't do as good of a job, but the short answer is that New Jersey has eliminated cash bail for almost all low-level offenders, and it's made a remarkable difference in our system. And I am happy to get you more information, because it is really important to understand, especially if you want to advocate for it in your own jurisdiction. It's a game changer.
It really is. Bail reform. I know this is the boring stuff. I mean, it's like bail reform, but bail reform is where it is at. If we had meaningful bail reform, poor people wouldn't have to make the choice between between fighting against an unlawful case and being able to get out of jail to take care of their family and to keep their job. Ken is asking, and I do love, this is such a Ken question, and I love it. So good. And so he's saying here, it just seems like we as a country on a balance, we have this punitive and racist bias mindset. And he says, unless we fix this kind of psychological mindset, it's going to be hard to make progress. So he asks, other than educating people through a book like yours, which is great, how else do you change the psychological fabric of people at the most personal level?
I think you do what we're doing, which is you just keep talking and you keep trying to listen with an open heart. I mean, these are problems that are so structural and systematic, and we need to continue having dialogues about racism and its impact on our lives, because it's everywhere. And dialogue is really important. I think the work that Brian Stevenson, who many of you know is one of my big heroes, in really illuminating stories of racism in the South that have been brushed under the rug for so long, whether it's through the lynching museum or putting up monuments about people who were lynched, just raising awareness of where we come from. Michelle Alexander's work documenting how prisons are just an extension of our racist past and policies. And once we get to understand that, then we can really say, do we really need prison? Why? We are one of the only countries, one of the most only developed countries that has the death penalty, but we are also only 25 states here have it, but really no one else has it. You can't be a part of the European Union if you have the death penalty. Latin America doesn't have it. South America doesn't have it. Most of Africa doesn't have it. We are outliers. But we are also one of the only countries that uses life without parole. Most places don't have whole life sentences, but we routinely say, like, he committed murder, he's got to be sentenced to life without parole, otherwise we're not going to show enough outrage. Well, what would happen if we really took a whole step back here and said, like, what are we doing? And how did we get here? And do we need to do it this way? And if we did that mindfully with a reflection on how we created our prison industrial complex in the first place, we might think differently.
I want to encourage everybody, if you haven't, because it's going right to what you're just talking about. Watch the documentary 13.
Yeah, it's great.
It will blow your mind, and it is.
Although not as much as my book.
No, but it's undeniable. The link between slavery and mass incarceration is undeniable, and it's direct, and it's astoundingly made in this documentary, and it's jaw-dropping. So watch that if you haven't. I have two more questions. Ken Sumner's, and then I want to ask you Watchung Booksellers.
I'm so glad you called on him because he's only the vice provost at Montclair State University. Hi, Ken.
Hi, Ken. All right. He's asking, is there any group that you can rely on to help you make decisions on local level elections to the courts or prosecutors that would help people decide whether a person is truly progressive or not? How would one know? Such a question.
Such a great question. And there's not enough information, to be honest. Some jurisdictions do rate them. And I feel like George Soros had something that he was rating. And I feel like I also saw something, you know what, Ken, I don't have the answer off the tip of my finger. I do think there's some of that rating and discussion that goes on, but not enough. Most of the time, it's really hard work in terms of individuals. And that's part of the problem. You go to the polls and you're like, all right, I'm just going to vote. I'm going to vote the incumbent because I don't know any better. And that's a problem if you're electing judges and prosecutors who are just doing the same old, same old. But it is hard to get underneath that.
In Austin, it's a little bit easier for those of, and I'm not trying to be too political, but for those who subscribe to a very progressive political philosophy, we have the Austin Chronicle. And you can almost always count on their endorsements of the most progressive candidates. I think they have gotten it wrong every now and again, but there's at least a resource that people can turn to. And maybe I don't know if there's in your local jurisdiction there's a paper like that. But I do want to end on this question from Watchung Booksellers, and I love this question. What inspired you to write this book? Was there one story that stood out, or just finding so many of them?
Well, it was actually, so I teach this class on wrongful convictions up at Montclair State. And in the course of getting ready for one of my classes, I stumbled on the National Registry of Exonerations database, and I started looking at no crime cases because, like many of you, I'd never really heard too much about them. And I study this. And then I fell down a really deep rabbit hole because the more I read, the more I couldn't believe. And then I did research and I realized nobody knew about this. No one was writing about this. Nobody was talking about it. And I felt like it was so important because it's such an injustice and it's something we can all rally around and say, this should not be happening. And so I was motivated to write this book. That's the outcome of that sort of outrage and that shock and that curiosity too. I mean, I just wanted to know more. I couldn't believe how often these things happen. And the more that I researched, the more I realized we know so little about how many people have really been impacted by these no crime cases.
Oh my gosh. I mean, you talk about the almost 1,000 in the registry, and it's a little bit like coronavirus. You know, no, listen, the numbers are the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah.
I think it's the tens, hundreds of thousands, especially in misdemeanors, that just are never captured.
No, we just don't know.
Happen every day. I want to end with this just because I got to tell you, like, I know I'm not, this book is so readable. Like, you know me, I have reading issues, and Jessica used to stand behind me in law school, by the way, guys. We'd be reading like a case, and she'd stand behind my chair and be like, let's go. And I'm like, dude, I'm still on sentence 2. I'm a slow reader. Very slow reader. And this book flies. I know we've talked so much about like policies and bail and policing, but what I love about your book, honestly, is you finish it and you're like, God, it's such a great overview, and it takes like 3 hours to read for a normal person, because it is truly a page turner. It's filled with stories that literally make your jaw drop. So I just want to encourage everybody, like, get the book, get it for people, get it for Christmas, Hanukkah, or just because this is a national conversation that we're having. Your book is so on point, and people need to read this. It is truly, to me, it is a primer on what is going on, and it really gives you tools and ammunitions to have smart conversations with other people about these incredibly important issues.
Well, thank you, Raman. That was so nice.
Thank you both. This was an amazing conversation, and Jessica, your book, Smoke No Fire, is an incredibly important contribution to shedding light and leading to reform. And Raman, having your expertise and your professionalism just added to the conversation. So thank you both for enlightening us and giving us also some tasks to do to help not resolve this, but work on it somehow.
Yeah, forward. That's all we can go, forward.
Thank you so much.
And just to remind everyone that Jessica's book is for sale, and if you would like to have a signed copy, she's available to sign, and we'll get it out to you. We are open at the store again, or so you can pop in, but if you want to have contactless pickup, please do so. And so thank you all for joining us tonight. We have a few events coming up. We have our first children's story time outdoors on the green with our favorite Christine Lombardi, who's really illustrated this magnificent little heartwarming book that'll be just perfect for this time. And on Wednesday, October 7th, we're going to host Nancy Burke, who'll be launching her new novel, Only the Women Are Burning, and she'll be in conversation with the award-winning writer Jenny Milchman, who also has wonderful connections with Montclair. And then on Wednesday, October 14th, we'll host authors Caroline Levitt and Jill McCorkle. Everything is listed on our website, so please feel free to click on and join us, and we look forward to having you back again. Thank you.